Hey everyone, it's Alexander here again for another installment of 30 Days of Symphony. Well, I'm wearing blue and yellow tonight because just once in our many-faceted journey together, celebrating the symphony, I'm going to talk about Sweden. Yes, Sweden. And it's one great composer who could be called, all due respect to Wilhelm Stenhammar and Hugo Alfvén, the one Swedish composer who can truly be called a genius. That very elusive figure from the early, middle 19th century, Franz Berwald, Berwald. And a treat is in store for you. Berwald is a composer whose music, whose life story I have held dear to my heart ever since I discovered his music as a teenager. And this is a symphony I so much hope that we can someday perform live for you in La Crosse. Berwald is not only from a very specific place, Sweden, but from a very specific time, that middle part of the grand, what we call the long 19th century, from which, we're sometimes embarrassed to admit it, most of the classical, symphonic classical music we love most comes from. Again, if you see the Romantic era, the long 19th century, as a kind of a three-part novel, the first part is the Age of Revolution, 1789 with the French Revolution, to 1815, the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Congress of Vienna, where for the first time, the big players on the chessboard of Europe sit down and try to make sense of it all. Then there's this middle period called the Age of the Concert of Europe, where there is this concert. There is generally a mode of harmony and peace and plenty. Then there's the third part of the long 19th century, from the middle kind of 1850s and 1860s, where we have the Crimean War, France, Britain, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, the sick man of Europe, as it was referred to. And then the wars of conquest of the middle 1860s, when Prussia replaces the Habsburg Empire as the great German imperial force. For the first time, we have something called a German Empire. And then in this final era, the Age of Conquest, which I'll get to later, from say the mid-1860s to 1914, we have that scramble for colonies, that grab for power between these big monarchical empires that will eventually result, of course, in the great conflagration of World War I. But it's this middle period of the 19th century, kind of, again, broadly speaking, 1815 to about 1865, that some historians, in a pejorative manner, refer to as the Biedermeyer Era, named after a kind of a style of poetry and design which became very popular with the middle classes in Vienna and became kind of a way of describing all of European culture in this period. I say it's used as a pejorative by some historians because it's a time, but I think wrongly so, because this is the time when, for the first time in human history, we had a burgeoning middle class, a class of self-made people, not the descendants of dukes and princes who were grabbing all their wealth by land, but no, people, self-made people who made things and who invented things and who had their own particular culture in their family lives, in their religious lives, in their business dealings, and in their cultural experience. It inspired an exquisite era of design in art, in painting, most significantly in furniture. It was a great era for the decorative arts. And also, though, in music. This is the generation of composers in between the fiery, Moses-like figure of Beethoven and poor Franz Schubert, the lyric poet. And then on the other side of the 19th century, those more dark-spirited, nationalistic, late Romantic composers. Wagner, Tchaikovsky, Bruckner, Dvorak, the Russian nationalists like Rimsky-Korsakov. And again, music being part of history, the ending was rather sad, as we know. But it's this middle era, this kind of peace and plenty era of European history that gives us the music of these great composers like Robert Schumann, Felix Mendelssohn, who gave us his music amongst many masterpieces, his music for Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And then up in Sweden, Franz Berwald. Berwald came from a German-speaking Swedish family of professional musicians. He himself was not a prodigy. Most great composers don't really begin as prodigies, actually. But was sent to Germany for further training, very gifted young man, and then he made his way, or attempted to make his way in the world as a great composer. To put it mildly, Berwald's career as a composer was one of hills and valleys. He was constantly trying to find fame and riches on the operatic stage, which is what everyone tried to do in 19th century music. Opera was the central genre, and so if you had a success there, it would replicate itself for you elsewhere. His efforts for the operatic stage were a total disaster, but along the way, he had other episodes in his life. When he first struck out as a composer, he moved to Berlin and started a medical institute. Then, after his second kind of set of failed experiences as a composer, he went to the north of Sweden and very successfully ran a sawmill. He started a sawmill and became a very prosperous man. But his muse never left him. And the works by which he is remembered today is this set of, like Robert Schumann, he left us 4 exquisite symphonies. Berwald's 4 symphonies each have a French nickname, because that's in that Biedermeyer era. If you wanted to appear sophisticated, you would, give things French titles. And on the one hand, why not? French is the most beautiful language in the world, so you might as well use it. But it was part of this style back then, which is kind of charming, I think. Each of his 4 symphonies had, by his own design, nicknames. There is the Symphonie Sérieuse, the Symphonie Capricieuse, the Symphonie Naïve, and the Symphonie Singuliere, the singular symphony, the unique symphony. And it truly is unique. Berwald's, aside from the fancy French nicknames, Berwald's 4 symphonies are like the 4 kind of Doric columns on this beautiful ancient Grecian temple. Clean and pure, but also very Nordic in their language. Like, I'm being perfectly serious, if you love Danish modern furniture, those clean, lean lines, very spare, no fussiness, you're going to love Berwald's music. There is a complete absence of padding, of rhetoric. When Berwald wants to end a movement, it just ends. It doesn't end like, say, a movement in Beethoven ends, where you get that series of dominant and tonic chords. It just ends. And this symphony, again, very Biedermeyer, kind of bourgeois on the surface, which is a good thing, but within that, incredibly innovative. The very first music that you hear, utterly serene and singular, unique. No one had ever written music like this before. It has this kind of Zen-like, kind of blissing out quality. All it is a C major scale, the notes of a C major scale. No one had ever done anything like this before. The symphony is also very innovative in that it is a symphony in which the traditional 4 movements of a symphony are telescoped into 3. The middle movement of the symphony's 3 movements is a slow movement, the middle into which in the middle you have a scherzo superimposed onto a slow movement. The main theme of the slow movement, this, my friends, is our Swedish femme fatale, this beautiful actress who enters the stage, and there's this heartbreakingly beautiful melody, but there is the sense of Nordic reserve. As the great Greta Garbo used to say, I want to be alone. This heroine, she wants to be alone. But it is the most beautiful melody that, again, in a shape and a form, a design unlike any other composer. In the finale of the symphony, Berwald, again, innovating based on tradition of Beethoven in the Ninth Symphony, gives us this fabulous example of cyclic form, where that heartbreaking femme fatale melody of the slow movement comes back out of nowhere. The kind of tortured development section comes to a screeching halt, and then this heartbreaking melody appears. It's all brought together in this great froth of a finale, and in a 3-movement symphony that's just a half hour of sheer delight. So now for Franz Berwald's Symphonie Singuliere, actually the recording that made Berwald's name familiar to many musicians in the 1970s, the Swedish conductor Ulf Björlin leads the Royal Philharmonic.